Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to be starting shortly. We want to let you know that we have simultaneous interpretation available. To activate the interpretation to Spanish, please click on the button with the globe called Interpretation. This is located at the bottom of the screen. Then select Spanish. And from a smartphone, you can click on the three dots and then on Interpretation and select Spanish. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Vamos a empezar pronto. Mientras tanto, queremos contarles que tenemos interpretación simultánea español. Tienen que presionar el botón con el globo, que se llama interpretación, en la parte de abajo de la pantalla, y luego seleccionar español. Si están conectados desde un teléfono, pueden presionar el botón con los tres puntos y seleccionar la opción de interpretación y luego español. For those of you who are just connecting, welcome. We will be starting shortly. We want to make sure everybody knows that we have interpretation to Spanish. If you need interpretation, please click on the button with the globe, hold interpretation at the bottom of the screen, then select Spanish. And if you're using a phone, you can click on the three dots and then interpretation and then select Spanish. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Vamos a empezar próximamente. Queremos anunciar que tenemos interpretación a español. Si usted necesita interpretación, por favor presione el botón con el globo en la parte de abajo de la pantalla y luego español. Si se está conectando desde un teléfono, presione el botón con los tres puntos y seleccione la opción interpretación y luego español. Welcome everyone. On behalf of our partners at Pratt Institute and the New School, we want to welcome to our session today. For those of you who just joined, I just want to make sure that you know that we have interpretation available. You can access the interpretation by clicking on the button with the globe at the bottom of the page and selecting the option for Spanish. If you're connecting from a smartphone, you can use the three dots, click on interpretation and then Spanish. Si usted todavía me está oyendo en español, y necesita interpretación en español, por favor presione el botón con el globo, se llama interpretación en la parte de abajo de la pantalla y luego español. O desde un teléfono presione el botón con los 3 puntos, seleccione la opción de español y luego seleccione español. Para los que me están oyendo en el canal de interpretación, vamos a hacer una prueba. Si usted me oye en este momento mediante la intérprete, por favor, deme thumbs up. O pongamos algo en el chat. Excelente, muchas gracias. Okay, so let's get started. On behalf of our partners at Pratt Institute and the New School, welcome to the first lecture of the Communities Beyond Crisis Speaker Series. My name is Juan Camilo Osorio. I'm an assistant professor at Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment. We are a department within the School of Architecture composed of 4 master's programs: City and Regional Planning, Historic Preservation, Sustainable Environmental Systems, and Urban Placemaking and Management. Our mission is to provide a professionally oriented education to a student body with diverse cultural, educational, and professional backgrounds. Using a multidisciplinary approach, we teach participatory practices as the best way to support and advocate for justice and equity. Students graduate equipped with theory, technical capacity, collaboration skills, and radical thinking abilities necessary to plan for ethical, healthy, resilient, and inclusive communities. Our partners include the Pratt Disaster Resiliency Network, a student-led initiative focused on addressing systemic and intersecting crises through efforts to elevate community expertise, hold space for learning and growth, and create a lasting network of partnerships within and outside of the Pratt community. The Tishman Environment and Design Center, the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management Program, and Professor Leonardo Figueroa Helland at the New School. Thanks so much to all individuals whose work has made this series possible. Communities Beyond Crisis will be discussing the ethical, political, and technical opportunities and challenges that are associated with planning for disaster risk reduction and recovery. A special emphasis will be placed on the prospect and implications of participatory action research, the contribution of grassroots women leaders in disaster situations, efforts against racist disaster recovery practices, and the experience of immigrant and indigenous communities in the recovery process. Today's event will be followed by a second conversation on April 1st with Maga Garcia, Ana Elisa Perez Quintero, and Guadalupe Carrasquilla from Organización Boricua. They will discuss the importance of agroecology and food sovereignty following disaster, with an emphasis on Puerto Rico's recovery after Hurricane Irma and Maria. With that, please join me in welcoming Dayna Cunningham. Dayna is the founder and executive director of CoLab, a planning and development laboratory in the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning that designs and builds innovative, large-scale, multi-sector development collaborations combining sustainability, wellness, and democratic control of local economies in socially marginalized communities. As program director of the Elias Project, an MIT-based collaboration between businesses, NGOs, and government, she worked with leaders using profound innovation processes to create multi-sector initiatives for economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Dayna worked as an associate director at the Rockefeller Foundation, and before that as a voting rights lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. A quick couple of housekeeping items. Dayna will present for about 40 minutes. I will then make a question to open the discussion, which will be moderated by James Chikoff from the Pratt Disaster Resiliency Network, taking questions from the audience. So please, everyone, use the chat to submit your questions. Dayna, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I am going to test my technology here and share my screen. But let me start by saying CoLab works in communities that are facing disruptive moments. Sometimes they are environmental crises, sometimes they are political changes or policy crises, as in, for example, the closure of a hospital to try to save money. But throughout, we are looking at places where the arrangements, the social, the economic arrangements are shifting, and often marginalized groups and communities are left out of the bargaining process. And so CoLab tries to work with communities on that tipping point of crisis to help them make their own plans. And the thing about crisis is that there's not enough time. It's urgent, and we've got to come up with remedies right away. And all of that is very true. But the other thing about crisis is that if there is not a solution that speaks directly to the needs of the people who are living in crisis, then actually you increase suffering. And so we have found that participatory action research is absolutely critical for developing the awareness, for developing the kinds of knowledge that communities need to be able to come up with appropriate solutions for themselves. And so at the same time, MIT is a very technical place, not unlike Pratt and the New School. And there's a real kind of stepping back when we say community knowledge is absolutely essential for this kind of work. And so at CoLab, we've really tried to develop an analytical approach that helps practitioners and students understand why PAR is such an important, rigorous approach, methodology for doing the work of extracting some kind of resources and inclusion from a crisis situation. So I'm going to talk to you today in pretty methodical terms about the practice of PAR. What is its epistemology? How is it applied on the ground? How is it different from traditional research methods? And then how, as a student or as a practitioner, could you kind of attune your own work using reflective practice to the PAR methodology? So I'm going to try not to talk for 40 minutes because I'd love to have plenty of time for questions and engagement. That's much more interesting than just listening to somebody drone on. So, but I'm going to go through a fairly methodical understanding of presentation of how PAR works. And for those of you, I understand a number of you are either studying PAR or using it in your capstone projects. Some of this may be familiar to you, and then you will become, in the discussion section, you will become experts as well, sharing your views and your understanding of this type of work. So now I am going to test my ability here to can you guys see the screen? My screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, and now I just need to figure out how to do the presentation. Okay, so this is what we're going to do today. We're going to really kind of methodically walk through why PAR, what is the underlying theoretical foundation for it, as a credible method of knowledge creation, and then what some of the methods and values are. We're going to talk about how PAR is different from traditional social science research methods, and then give you a few tools to help you enhance your own work and your own practice in this respect. So first, we define. And why am I unable to advance the slides? There we go. So I like a very rigorous definition of PAR to start with so that we know what we're talking about. And what we say in CoLab is that PAR is a disciplined inquiry into what we need to know but do not know now in order to solve a consequential social justice challenge that is identified by a community. All of these words are really important. PAR is not simply collecting narratives. It is a disciplined inquiry. It assumes that because you are addressing a consequential problem, that the stakes are high. And so you want rigor across all of the mixed methods you use, and you want to select your methods based on the nature of the challenge. And then, of course, it is critical that the community itself define and identify what the challenge is. Just making sure. So the first question is, what is knowledge? And I tell my students all the time that this question becomes more and more complex in our current environment. That, you know, the knowledge wars that are happening now, how you know that you know, is actually a pretty important debate right now. So here's one way of thinking about how knowledge is created. Starting with concrete experience, reflective observation, then backing away for conceptualization, experimentation on the basis of that conceptualization, and then bringing that back to reflect on concrete experience. So that's one way of understanding how people harvest and assimilate knowledge. I love this picture. So this is someplace famous in Italy. I wish I should have remembered. But what is important about this is a visualization of a pretty important debate with Aristotle and Plato. So Plato is standing up. He's in the red garment with his hand straight up in the air. He's saying knowledge can be abstracted. It can be kind of, knowledge comes from theory and conception, from ideas. And that is the origin of knowledge. And Aristotle is here on the ground, on the stairs, and he's pointing down and he's saying it's right underneath our feet. And we actually have to discern it from our own experience. And that's kind of more or less a key part of the debate in social science. Where does knowledge come from? Can it just be derived from context and experience, or must it be, does it derive from an abstract conception that then knowledge and experience gets fit into? So that brings us to the epistemology of PAR. And let me just say, I can't see all of your faces here, but if somebody has an urgent burning question, please put your hand up, and I hope one of the facilitators will see the question and let me know. And yeah, so epistemology of PAR. There are two ways of thinking about the social world. This gets back to Aristotle versus Plato. One view is that the world is an objective reality that's meant to be measured, described, and documented. That's positivism. The other is that it is a system of institutions, practices, and narratives that are co-created by human. And that's kind of this idea of intersubjectivity and meaning making by humans through their social experience. And we like to say that PAR rejects both of those kind of rigid perspectives. And PAR says the researcher's task is to both take an objective measure and to understand the social context within which that objective measure exists, and constantly measuring theories against actual reality. And that's the philosophical stance of that is pragmatism. And that's just another way of framing that. So here we go, just very quickly. PAR is always context bound. The knowledge is relevant to the place, and it's about real life problems. It is inquiry through which participants and researchers or co-researchers co-generate knowledge using a communicative process in which all forms of knowledge and all forms of contributions are taken seriously. It treats the diversity of experience and capacities within a local group as an opportunity for the enrichment of research, of the research action process. That's really important. It is to say that when you are in a PAR process, you're kind of looking for disjuncture and disruption as an important source of data about what you're trying to achieve, particularly when you are addressing questions of power and marginality. And I'm not going to read every single one to you, but the idea that going back to that kind of cycle of reflection and action is key, and workability is a key measure of success and reliability and credibility. Does it actually help solve a problem? And in the process, does it increase participants' control over their own situations? So here you have kind of a contrast of traditional social science research and participatory action research. And what I want to really focus on is how PAR is different. So we've already said workability is central. Knowledge production is actually through diverse perspectives and close and trusting relationships, far from distorting the research process, because you are talking about social process, actually helps to ensure that the information that you are receiving is solid. And generalizability is not just about inferences to be based on a huge sample of data, but it is through a rigorous process of seeking to apply the findings to other contexts. And it requires knowledge and thought about the details of another context so that you can see where the overlaps and where the connections are. Practice. Oops. Very important. We've said this already. Co-creation is critical. Collaborative decision-making is at the core because you are talking about agency. And these are the topics over which the co-researchers must share decision-making authority. And finally, very, very important for the process, it must include capacity building. And the way in which capacity is built is through what we call discursive arenas, spaces where community members and researchers can together step back and have room to make sense of what they are learning. And the other piece of it is the PAR practitioner, both the community-based PAR practitioner and the academic PAR practitioner, uses reflective practice to constantly look back at and take stock of their own awareness, their own positionality, their own effectiveness. And one of the things I come across with my students, like Pratt and the New School, they are students who, many of whom come from an elite background. And they spend a lot of time fretting about their privilege. And while I think that is noble to be thinking about kind of where you stand in relation to the research enterprise, it's also, there's some arrogance in assuming that privilege is the only thing that describes your positionality. Because when you are working in a community where the people that you are engaged with have years of knowledge and experience and understanding of the local context, in many ways, you're at a disadvantage. And that's not privilege. You don't really know. And holding on to that is also really important. So that's part of the sort of the reflective practice piece. I've gone over this a little bit, but just very quickly. Why is it important now? John Dewey, American pragmatic philosopher, Paulo Freire, Brazilian, and Arjan Appadurai, South Asian, all talk about the importance of research to the meaningful exercise of citizenship. And Appadurai actually says, in a complex technological world, you cannot meaningfully exercise your citizenship rights without having a right to actual, the wherewithal to do the research. So in CoLab, we say that the right to research is an essential component of democratic citizenship. And that seems never more timely and relevant than right now with all of the information and knowledge wars happening around the world. And so here's the last piece of this. So as a practitioner, how do you stay on top of all of that? How do you know that you are actively harvesting knowledge appropriately through the research process? Reflective practice is your ticket, is the key to continuously understanding not just what you are learning, but how you are learning it, and ensuring that you are learning it in a way that is inclusive of all the essential knowledges that are present in any kind of community-based research enterprise. So that's the question. What is it? Are you one? So Donald Schoen, who is the kind of originator of the term reflective practice, though let me just say that there are all kinds of forms of reflective practice and inquiry that go way back before Donald Schoen. He put it in the context of policy work, and that's why he stands out and is identified as a key kind of connector of this way of work to planning and other kinds of policy practices. And so Schoen talked about reflection in action and reflection on action. Reflection in action is in the moment as a practitioner, having some sense of your own, some way of kind of stepping back and a kind of a meta cognition about your own stance, your own conduct, your own work in a process. And reflecting, and so that's in the moment, and then reflecting on action is understanding after the fact, looking back at your work and looking back at the context. Both of these are really important skills of the reflective practitioner. So I'm going to ask everybody to take 3 minutes, just 3 minutes. Grab a piece of paper. Don't think a lot. And just jot down your responses to these questions. And I'm going to read them out loud so they can be translated. And I'm going to ask you, don't think about the question. Don't write it down as I'm talking. Just once I stop talking and the translation is complete, just you put your pen on the paper and see what flows out of your pen. So the first is, how do you select and use methods for your engagement with partners and communities? How do you know what makes sense? Is this something that you engage in your work with communities? Next question. During your engagement, do you practice reflection in action, in the moment? If so, what are your strategies? And feel free actually to add in the chat your answers to these questions so that when I take the screen down, when I take the presentation down, we can kind of get a feel from the assembly of how people think about this stuff. And don't be shy, and please don't leave the chat empty. Don't do me like that. Put something in the chat if you are moved to do so. The last question is, how does reflecting on action, so this is after the fact, looking back, help you remain accountable in your work and with the communities you work with? Again, feel free to add your thoughts to the chat. Okay, and with that, I'm going to take down the screen and pull up the chat. I see, okay, so I've got a few comments in the chat. Please continue to populate the chat. And we're also going to just ask people, can we unmute folks? Or are we just using the chat? Can somebody just let me know?
I think it's easier if we use the chat.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to read some of this stuff. Researching is always good. Talking to all the individuals involved. First, for the first question, understanding the cultural context is key. The language is spoken, access to the internet, age of those you are engaging with. This can help steer towards selecting methods. Very important. And we've got an incomplete thought here. Please, is that Gundega? If you could please, oh wait, maybe it's all there, sorry. No, it looks like Gundega, you did not finish your thought. It's a combination of various factors, I assume, but tell us more. Working with community-based organizations to identify partners, language needs, and access needs. So that again, this idea of language, critical if you are talking about meaning making as coming from the interchange of ideas. You've got to be able to have language across the various meaning makers. Sophia Mathau says, I need to know the community to decide which method to use. Absolutely. And hearing more about how you get to know the community. What do you do? Are you spending time in public spaces? Are you hearing from key informants where the community tends to congregate? Are you working with community organizations that are the hub of the community and pull people in that way? So that's really important. I listen more than I speak, and I prefer to listen to the people I'm working with. That's unusual for a researcher, actually, and great to see. Yeah, you got to listen. Listening is actually the key way we understand, we gather information as humans, whether it's through storytelling, whether it's through conversation. Listening and your ability to listen in a particular way, in a non-judgmental way, suspending the voices that often cloud our perceptions, right? So let me just stop on this for a minute and tell you about listening. So I'm sure most of you have had the experience of having a running dialogue in your own head about something. And you often don't even fully hear, sometimes it's your kids or your parents or a particularly difficult neighbor. You're not really listening to what they're saying. What you're doing is listening to the dialogue in your own head about what they're saying. And I like to call that the radio. It's like this imaginary radio that's just playing all the time in your head. And it's saying, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Or why do they always try to manipulate me that way? Or they must be scared of being stupid. And that is stupid. There's a whole conversation that's really in your head that is not in reality in front of you. And one of the most important skills to learn is just that, to know that there's a radio playing in your head, that it is not actually what is happening right in front of you. And so that requires, and this is part of reflection in action, that requires you to notice, oh, that's the radio. That's not actually what's in front of me. My kid actually isn't being disobedient or disrespectful. I'm concluding that my kid is being disobedient and disrespectful, and I need to know the difference. I'm not saying kids are never disobedient and disrespectful. I'm just saying that having the awareness that there's a conversation going on in your head that may not be aligned with reality is really important to develop the skills for listening in a way that you can harvest the most information. So Mike, thank you for that. Listening more than you talk. And I love Gundega has now come back and said the combination of experience and intuition and being flexible and porous. And porous is such a great word here. The complexity of life in the communities that are facing the most dire circumstances require just an openness to multiple realities that may be so different from our own. You know, your house is washed out and you are living in a chicken coop. And, you know, and understanding what it means for this family to live in a chicken coop. And what they can tell you about what they need in a disaster relief program is critical information for how you design that program. I see Yuri coming back and saying visioning exercises and focus groups. Always a useful method. A more positivist approach in the sense that you know, focus groups are a fairly scientific and kind of objective way of approaching. But there's also, yeah, and that's fine. And you also want to think about surveys, right? And, you know, getting larger data sets about the problem that you are dealing with. But here's the thing about PAR and about this pragmatic approach. When you have a survey, or when you are in a focus group and you've got your, you know, you've already got your thinking going about how you're going to code the themes of these interactions and these data gatherings, you want to be careful to not too quickly discard data that seems like noise. Because sometimes you'll find the most valuable information through what appears to be noise. And I'm going to give you an example. A group of researchers does work on community attitudes towards crime based on their reading of newspapers. And they're trying to figure out how journalism and editorialization affects perceptions of crime. So they do a survey, and one of the questions is, should people who commit robberies, and I'm forgetting the specific details, but should people who commit robberies go to jail for the maximum sentence? And two groups of people said no. But several people wrote in the margins. And one person wrote, they should not have the maximum sentence because jails are overcrowded and it is cruel. And somebody else wrote in the margins, no, because that leaves us less room to arrest more people. Very, very different understandings of crime in those two statements. Same answer. But without that margin noise, you know, writing, just like sort of reading the notes that are not supposed to be there, that you're supposed to discount as noise, you don't understand that nuance. So really important. Let's see. Open communication and collaboration with community partner or partners. Checking in. Ask, is this working? Can it be better? Still working? Why? Excellent. Communication is key. And I would also say that before you begin any kind of PAR process, you want to work through a memorandum of understanding. You want to make sure that all the parties involved understand what they're trying to do and what their various roles are and what the deliverables will be. It's really important to sort of clarify up front what the expectations are. Phoebe says, what work does this do? Referring to the impact of different research methods. Very, very important. If you are studying increased rates of cancer by a lake, you're going to want to know, very much, you're going to want to know how many parts per million of toxins are in the lake. That's a pretty straight measure, describe, measure, document, describe kind of project. You want to know actually what in the environment might be causing the problem. But then you're also going to want to understand through interviews, through observation, how is the community interacting with this body of water that may be polluted. And so there was a really interesting case, I believe it was in Staten Island. A very diverse immigrant community is being researched by, I think it was NIH. And they were trying to figure out what the level of toxic exposure was existing in the community. And they started out by saying, we're going to focus mainly on, and did I say this was a coastal community? So the researchers said, we're going to focus mainly on air toxins and earthborne toxins, dirt, because in a standard urban diet, those are the main forms of exposure that people have to toxicity. And the community said, we have a Hasidic community, we have a South Asian community, we have an immigrant Caribbean community, and we have diets that are so diverse, a standard urban diet doesn't even make sense. But most of all, we're a seaside community and we have subsistence fishermen. If you don't help us understand what's in the water, and let me back up. When I say subsistence fishermen, I mean community residents who are in the bay getting their dinner. And if we don't know what's in the water, we will never know what the toxic load is. So this idea of knowing the work that you are trying to do and what kinds of research methods within the specific context that you are working in is absolutely critical to actually get the job done. I love this. David Cow says, the squeaky wheel partners garner the most attention. Yes, by asking who else should be at the table. To remain accountable, promote outreach to those who are missing from the room. Absolutely. You always want to interrogate the absences, the silences, the missing pieces that can easily be overlooked if you want to understand the fullest scope of the problem you are confronting. And when you just think about it, victims of violence living in a community who are daily facing their aggressors, how likely are they going to be to step forward with a lot of information about community security? And yet, if you really want to get a full picture of community security, isn't it really important to find out about security within the home and, within the neighborhood, not just kind of the abstraction of strangers maybe connecting with each other in violent and aggressive ways? Really, really important. And so in that situation, having good ties with the community, understanding who the trusted leaders are, where the spaces are for people who are not likely to come forward, but where are the safe spaces, if any, those are really, really important questions. Brown Seabright says, I consult with others who have more experience than myself. I look to the folks I am working with to see their methods and practice. I try to reflect in the moment by taking notes and documenting my work to read later. Great. And to review. It helps me recognize if my work has traction, if what I am producing is resonating, and if there are paths to implementation through partnerships. All wonderful stuff. And Brown, you're also going to want to look for people who really disagree with you, who really don't like what you're up to, because they have really important sources of information. Now, sometimes they're just trying to mess with you, right? They're just trying to disrupt the process because they have their own agendas. But that's for you in conversation to discern and not to just dismiss out of hand. So we could keep going on, but I want to get to Q&A. So let's hear from folks, and maybe somebody can help me with the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dayna. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful and inspiring presentation. Everybody, please join me in really thanking Dayna for this amazing presentation. You've already laid the groundwork for such an interesting conversation. Before I actually pass the mic to James Chikoff, who's actually going to be facilitating the conversation, I wanted to ask you one question. Sure. I thought that it was very provoking how you framed the conversation. And I wanted to ask, what is your advice for those researchers who still find themselves between the two paradigms? Between the positivistic forces that claim that research has to be objective and separate from social and political agendas, and then the communities that are suffering, where there's a sense of urgency, where people cannot wait for perfect research results, where we need to manage uncertainty, learn how to deal with it, because inaction is simply not an option. What can you share some examples of, how do you address these challenges on the ground?
I have to say that we have a luxury, Juan Camilo, of being, our center is organized to work with communities. So we're not a set of graduate students who have to defend our master's theses or our dissertations. And that helps a lot to be kind of one step removed from the, from the most rigorous, I want to say rigid expectations of the academy. So we say, we are here to work with communities. I actually think we are in this strange, crazy moment in our society where suddenly that just becomes more plausible. I mean, I don't know if you guys have heard this research, but 40% of Americans in the US have said that higher education is a risk to communities, that it does harm. Where does that come from? How is it that something that probably many of our families and parents have said is the only route to success is through these institutions of higher education? How can it be that almost a plurality of people in the US think that it's a net harm? And I think it has to do with the fact that these institutions have become ivory towers that are closed off from themselves, within themselves, and don't do anything to support the communities, even within which they sit. And so I think there's more room in many spaces to simply say, I'm doing
lugar en muchos espacios para decir.
Oh, I'm suddenly getting the translation in my ear.
Sorry about that. I'll fix that.
It's okay.
Did we get that fixed?
I think so. Lydia, can you say something?
Yes, can you hear me now?
I can still hear you, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I wasn't assigned as an interpreter then.
Let's try that again. I think we should be good now. I see the interpretation is back on.
Okay. Lydia, can you say something? Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so I think there's more openness to saying we have got to address real world problems of non-elites just in the world. And I think the other thing that is really important is, Juan Camilo, that you have to be able to defend the rigor of your methods. There's nothing that says that because you are working with communities, you can't bring or you shouldn't bring all of the most defensible, thoughtful research designs and research projects. In fact, I would argue it's even more imperative when you are trying to work with a community that is facing a deadly flood, that you are rigorous in how you approach the asking of questions and the setting of a program. So I think that's what we argue for at CoLab. And James, if I can ask, you are now highlighted on the screen, and I was hoping to be able to see folks, and I only see you. Not that I don't want to see you, but.
Yeah, folks, feel free to turn on your cameras per Dayna's request, but we will continue on here with some Q&A. We have a question from Delaney, who is one of the students in this course. And so she was wondering if you have any advice for how to have the conversations and dialogues with community members about the things that can be traumatic for folks to think about. And how do we facilitate safe space for that dialogue and help bring care to the room in which people share such personal information?
Oof. Delaney, that's really a great question, and I think one that has to be handled with utmost care. So in CoLab, we talk about what's called the social field. And if you've heard of the social field, just put your hand raised icon up. It comes out of theory from Bourdieu, but again, it is kind of an ancient idea that the social world consists of bodies, and by that I mean spaces that have an organic structure to themselves. And so the social field is comprised of words, gestures, histories, culture, habits. And within any given space, there is a social field, and it's kind of like a farmer's field in that these different histories and habits and gestures are like rocks and bugs and roots. They're all in there. And as a par researcher seeking to create safe and brave space, you want to very much pay attention, because in the social field, what you tend to grows. And so you want to be that farmer who is tending the seeds of empathy. And what does that look like? It looks like modeling yourself listening with kindness and compassion. It means attending to any kind of aggressive and violent conversation that arises and addressing it in the moment. It looks like articulating up front the intention to create a safe and brave and compassionate space. And it looks like insisting on, well, two things. It looks like making sure to make it safe for anybody to leave the room at any given point. And in part, the way you do that, making that an option for people, is by making sure to issue trigger warnings. And so I have to tell you, that is my value set. And the other day I showed a movie, and it was a scene from Roma, the movie Roma. And I actually was not being very rigorous in setting up my class. I had seen this movie so many times. I had taught this lecture so many times, and I didn't screen it before I showed it. And it's been a year, a crazy year, when a lot has just been wiped from my memory. I just didn't remember how violent it was. And I just put it on and let it roll. And I should never have done that. I should have screened it beforehand, looked for the, kind of gauged the level of concern or threat, frankly, in the piece, and then announced beforehand what you're about to see can be very upsetting. And if you want to leave the class or turn off your screen and come back afterwards, feel absolutely free. So we have to do a lot of that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, those are some great talking points about the facilitating those safe spaces and creating that dialogue. We have another question from Aaron, who asks, can you speak more about workability, and how would you define and measure this when assessing the project, research, or actions within PAR?
So for me, workability is, does it help to solve a problem actually in real life? And the starting point for that is actually really understanding what problem you're trying to solve. And so in this work we did in Brooklyn, there was one problem that we were trying to solve was keeping a hospital open. But another problem we were trying to solve was to make sure that the hospital didn't keep struggling with outsized healthcare costs because the community was healthier. And so if we had just managed to write a report that struck a deal that allowed that, that sort of embarrassed the governor into keeping the hospital open, that would not have been a workable solution. And so it required us to dig deeper into this local context. And the PAR in that case involved students from MIT working with high school and college students from Brooklyn to do community health needs and asset surveys. So they actually understood, so that the community members understood for themselves what actually needed to be addressed in this healthcare initiative. And they themselves came to understand that even though they began by just trying to save the hospital, to save the jobs, to save the hospital's economic engine, all very, very important, they came to realize that this would be just like grabbing bodies as they fall from a train. And that that there were ways, it was a question of access to green space and healthy food access. And like for the healthy food access, it came down to, can bodegas rent affordable refrigerators, not from Coke and Pepsi, with big advertising and most of the space reserved for Coke and Pepsi? So those kinds of inquiries about what are we actually really trying to get done here is the beginning of an understanding of workability. And then, okay, so if we know that there are high rates of diabetes, we know that because we've done a health needs and asset survey. And if we know that it seems like in hearing from residents that a big source of diabetes is soda, then where do we go to find out what's happening with the soda? But once we find out who is supplying most of the soda, it's not enough. So this was an interesting piece, because then the community was like, why are you people always selling us soda? We don't want any more soda. And the bodega owners were like, because we can't afford a full-size refrigeration unit. And Pepsi is giving us subsidized refrigeration units, but the bargain is that we have to stock it with Pepsi. So then it became, how does the community work with the bodega owner to get resources for renting a refrigerator that doesn't require Pepsi? So those kinds of, so that's just a really simple example of what workability can look like.
Someone actually had a quick follow-up on that. If you have the link or the reference to that study from MIT and Brooklyn College, anyone?
Wait, you're asking me if I have it?
Right. They were asking in the chat.
Yeah, I do, but I can't, I couldn't locate it right now. I'll make sure that Juan Camilo has it. And,
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you follow up YT with your email address, we could follow up with that study. Speaking more on PAR, Leah has a question that says, can you speak to PAR specifically within the policy setting environment? How does PAR for policymaking vary from PAR for research or projects?
Yeah. So Brooklyn is another example, but I have to tell you, I would love to see some faces. I don't see any I see just names, and you all have beautiful names. The only person on the screen is Delaney. And now I see Tazmi. Am I pronouncing that right? Zami? How do you pronounce your name? Zami? Got it. It would be just nice to see some faces. Please, I got to have my face on here. Can some people put their faces on here? I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And just to say, hi, Marcella. Oh my goodness, it's been so long. If you really don't feel comfortable being on the screen, I'm not trying to throw shade. I'm just asking if it's just a convenient choice. Let me talk to faces instead of just names. Hey, Luis Gilberto, great to see you. What was the question again?
Yeah, so the question was, and this is so much better now that we can see everyone. I agree. It's like we're in person. The question was, can you speak to PAR specifically within the policy setting environment? Yeah. So how does PAR for policy making vary from PAR for research or projects?
So I'm going to go back to the Brooklyn project because it's the one on my mind right now. And so in Brooklyn, we did a health needs and assets survey, and that was followed by this participatory action research work with high school students from the community and MIT students. And they went around and got much more granular information about kind of habits and access than the big report did, because the big report had a lot more kind of, it was really focused on crunching a bunch of databases. It was very useful stuff. But when the students went back and did their inquiry, they became really energized and decided they were going to make a presentation back to the community about what they found. And this was incredibly powerful to see these young high school students confidently presenting their statistical analyses and breakdown of what they had found. And as part of it, they had recommendations. And they did such an extraordinary job. There were people from the governor's office at this public report back session. And it became clear to them that they couldn't ignore it because the presentation was compelling. There were electeds, there were ministers, there were community organizations, there were healthcare workers, Local 1199, the healthcare union was in the room, New York State Nurses Association, the nurses union was in the room. It was clear that this was a force to be reckoned with. And so this was par for policy. It was par for policy. It was the purpose of it, and this is PAR at its best. I'm going to come back to this idea of PAR at its best, but the purpose of it was to shift the proposal to close the hospital and come up with something workable that would advance, support, improve the community's health. So, but here's the other thing about PAR. There is no like one way of doing PAR. And so we like to talk about it as a spectrum and as a, we talk about par-like work. And this can be a very slippery slope. And at some point, it's down to the accountability of you and your community partners. But not every process has the time, the resources, the bandwidth to do every part of an ideal par process. It doesn't mean that working with a community, that doing a set of things that gets closer to knowledge co-creation with the community isn't a really powerful thing. And so kind of the key elements that make it par, to my mind, are one, you have to you have to define the problem with the community residents, or else you don't really know what you're doing. And you have to agree together on the research approach. And you have to agree with the purpose of the research and agree on how the research products will be used. To me, that's what makes something par. And I guess I said this, but let me say it again. Your co-researchers are the people who are most intimately connected to the problem that together you have defined. And beyond that, there's a lot of things you can add to that strengthen it as a par process. And but those are the things that I would say define when something is a par process.
Thank you for that discussion. And we have a kind of an extension of the policymaking sphere of questions. One question from YT here is, one way that universities are harmful is through eminent domain and taking building space that has caused rent and land prices to appreciate faster than communities can afford. Yes. Pointing out that Columbia and NYU are master culprits. I'm sure we can point to a few others as well. And so their question at MIT. And so the question is, how can we establish reparations for this explicit economic harm to communities? And I guess I would extend that to, tying it into that par that has to be engaged with communities.
So I have to tell you, that is a fight that I have explicitly decided not to take on inside of MIT. I just don't have the bandwidth to take that question on. And what I have decided is that my task at MIT is to take that powerful brand, not unlike the Pratt and New School brands, and use it to enhance the credibility of community claims. I've just made that decision. How much can I do in the 8 to 10 hours a day that I'm working? And that's just, many people would accuse me of hypocrisy for that. That's just where I have decided to draw the line. So we do work with anchor institutions, but we do not bring it home. And that is a form of hypocrisy, one might say. We have lots of tools and materials. There's a great organization, the Democracy Collaborative, which you go on their website, they just have tons of information about how to make anchor institutions more responsive to communities. And we certainly do it in the context of hospitals in New York City, but we're not taking it on at MIT. And so I don't have any direct advice for you on that.
Well, thank you for that. We have a question from Gundega, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. I apologize. So she says, I really appreciate your comment on privilege, another concept that one group is trying to appropriate and make universal. It would be great if you could elaborate a bit on that aspect.
On the appropriation and effort at universalization, exactly what aspect? I just want to get clear.
I'm assuming on the Gundega, if you would like to clarify in the chat, but give her a moment. And for the rest of y'all still hanging around. We still have about 10 to 15 more minutes. So if there's any other questions, please continue to write them in the chat.
Okay, Gundega is going to elaborate in the chat. Take another question and come back to that because it's a great, I sense it's a great question, just understanding, want to answer the right question.
Right. Well, that's actually where we're at with questions right now, which is why I sent the little reminder about, we still have about 10 to 15 more minutes if anyone has any further questions. But in the meantime, we could wait for that elaboration. And let's see.
No pressure, Gundega.
Okay, someone had a question in the chat. A couple of questions actually just came in. So the first one from Phoebe, is there a meaningful difference between CBPR and PAR? What is it?
I don't think there's a big difference. I think these, folks like to give their own names to things, and I'm all for that. But I guess you could say that you could do participatory action research in multiple settings, not just in community settings. And so maybe that's a way of distinguishing it. But I think these are minor distinctions. What has been a moment where this has all been really difficult, and how did you get through that? Wow. We had a case, this was actually a class, and we were working with an immigrant rights organization. And the leader of the organization had come up with what we thought was an absolutely brilliant idea about an economic development program that would leverage kind of the circuit of people going back and forth between this very rural Mexican town and the community that the organization was in. We loved this idea, and it just resonated with all of our kind of values and our narrative about what CoLab does. And we jumped with both feet right into it, and the students jumped in. Everybody was really excited. And we soon found out that there was absolutely no appetite for it on the part of the members of the organization. That in fact, the town in Mexico was so tiny and so depopulated that the idea of like selling products back and forth and bringing them back and forth, it just wasn't realistic. There just wasn't a capacity in the town to create and export these kind of home products. It just wasn't realistic, and people were just not into it at all. And so that was really hard for us as teachers, because we had set it up as this is going to be such a great project and you're going to really do something meaningful, and we were wrong. So on that level, like admitting to your students, and actually the students came to us and said, we have now talked to people and they are not interested, and it is irresponsible of us to move this project forward. So we won't do it. And so A, I was really proud of our students, really proud. B, I was embarrassed because we should have had a way of knowing that beforehand. And C, as a teacher, I had to figure out, well, what are we grading you guys on? Just as a practical matter, like, what are we doing here? And they ended up writing a manual about, now I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but they worked out there was an interest in maintaining this hometown association and enhancing its functions and strengthening it. And they ended up working on some kind of tool to support the deliberations of the hometown association. And they did a really good job. They really, because they were so righteous, they actually helped to educate the leader in the US about maybe where the leader had gone a little bit without enough guidance and consulting from the people in the hometown. And so in the end, it felt like the right thing ended up happening, but it was grueling. And I also want to say that, the both members in the US and in the hometown were excited and looking forward to doing something together. So that was the other piece of it. It was like just disappointing all around. But I think in the end, it worked out to be something meaningful enough. And we learned a lot. Everyone learned a lot. Okay. I see. Okay, so we have 9 minutes. And okay, so we've got these. Okay, so the university's community harm. An introvert harm directed at the MIT communities as well, graduate and undergraduate research assistants. Yes, all of that. So, and then I see if you can follow up with organizations that do opt to fight this battle. Yeah, I don't know of any organization, I just want to say this, that fights its own university to become more of an anchor institution. I just don't know, but you might reach out to the Democracy Collaborative, go on their website and see if you can find anything there. And then, so this a thing about the internal harm is a very, very, very live debate at MIT, for example, and graduate students are organizing and they have won some concessions from the school around pay, around insurance, on a couple of issues. And I think that's just, students have to be organized and just fight. I don't know what else to say about that. We can support that fight in some ways, but that's really just straight up organizing work. Okay, focusing on our privilege in the West, we tend to diminish, disregard, and erase knowledge, value systems, strengths, immunities of other communities in different contexts. It somehow resonates with what you said, that we can be disadvantaged and weak when facing unknown in a different context. Yes, so we really, I hope I'm answering your question, Gundega, but we really emphasize the need for other ways of knowing. We also call it epistemological diversity. There's a ton of different ways of understanding and interpreting your context. And you only get richer data by expanding the means that you use. So whether it's traditional forms of knowledge, whether it's embodied knowledge, whether it is sound, we actually last semester in our PAR theory class, we assigned as a final project a lexicon of the most important PAR terms. And we encouraged everybody to not use a text-based form. And we got the most amazing stuff. One group did a lexicon as a beat maker. So they came up with 10 words and then they built beats to go with the 10, to describe the 10 terms. And then they created it so that you could add words and make your own beats. And I have to tell you, when I first heard about this project, I was like, I don't know. But when I heard the music, it was extraordinary. Juan Camilo, I know that resonates. It was so on point, and it was so much more evocative than hope. hope is a condition that you feel when you have opportunities moving in your direction. No, it was like a heartbeat with this like rumble underneath it. It was just extraordinary. And so we really look for alternative forms of other forms, really important. If it is, these are alternative, then what's the main thing? We want to get rid of that kind of a dichotomy. So what are the forms that people can use to give a full expression to their understanding of their context? We did another thing, we call it social presencing theater. And it's where you use your body to express your understanding. We did this work in a community in the Pacific region of Colombia. And the group we were working with it was in Buenaventura, for those of you who know the Pacific region, Luis Gilberto and Juan Camilo. They were talking about the strike, the civic strike that closed the city down. And they were doing this embodied representation of how the strike happened. And one of the most interesting things was they made the street a character in their theater. So it was like a person embodied the street. And it was such an interesting way of understanding how important the community turning out, being in the street, how the street functioned as a critical civic institution in that context. Everybody, and the form of it, the way you do it, I can give Juan Camilo, I can give you some background on this, but the way you do it, you're not supposed to think about it, you're supposed to do it. And even the people doing it were like, whoa, the street. Yeah, that's right. So I say that to say that we use these different forms to mine knowledge that is not necessarily accessible to the rational thinking mind, but that is essential for a development or a resilience or regeneration process.
Well, a lot of questions came in at the last moment. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time remaining, but I did want to just ask this one last final question because it's a good wrap up, I feel, from Sabrina. And it's just, what are any words of advice when working with a community of professionals who have always had the expert role to try to get them to center communities that have been marginalized? So just a quick concluding thought there, I think would wrap us up.
That's always a fight. That is why we teach PAR, because we want to avoid the problem by teaching emerging practitioners before they become too invested in their own technical expertise to see the broader range of knowledge and practice that they can be involved in with really powerful results. And we try in our work, you do need all kinds of experts. And so we try to create a container that is bounded by the values and the commitments of the community process. And so if we're trying to save the hospital and build a different way of doing community-based health, then we're asking all of the experts to step into that question and to meet with the community. And here's the other thing, it's actually true, you can't work with all communities in this way. Because if the community does not have enough capacity to direct and to be a peer in this process, it's very hard to have a positive result. Now, it's very easy for MIT or New School or Pratt experts to overshadow the expertise of the community. And so there is an important role of stepping back and ensuring that there's space for voices. But also, a lot of our community partners are like, no, that's not what we asked for. And so you're looking for partners who will fire you if you don't do the right thing. That's always the best condition for working in a community. It's not always possible, but it's best when you have, that kind of really activated partnership.
Well, thanks again, Dayna, and our guests and our team for such an exciting conversation. We're wrapping up now. Sorry, we're a little bit over the time, but as discussed earlier, today's event is the first session in a 5-part series, which will be followed by a conversation on April 1st with Magna Garcia Medina, Ana Elisa Perez Quintero, and Elda Guadalupe Carrasquilla from Organización Boricua to discuss the importance of agroecology and food sovereignty following disaster, with an emphasis on Puerto Rico's recovery after Hurricane Irma and Maria. So please RSVP for the rest of the series using the link in the chat. I'll send it one more time for you folks. And that's all. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all. Take care.